Good morning, everyone. I am excited to be around the table of our King Jesus this morning and excited to study with you an account taken from a story around the table of King David, which is found in 2 Samuel chapter 9. 2 Samuel chapter 9. My thoughts today were inspired by a sermon our good brother Phil Robertson did year before last when he held our meeting, and I want to build on those and apply them to the Lord's Supper specifically today. By this point in David's life here in 2 Samuel chapter 9, the civil war with the house of Saul is over. David is established now as king over all of the nation of Israel, over all of its tribes, in his new capital city, which is the city of Jerusalem. Not only that, but back a couple of chapters, in chapter 7, David received a wonderful promise from the Lord. A promise that God would establish a royal dynasty, a lineage that would come from David that would always serve on the throne in Judah. And also a promise that someone in that lineage would build the house of the Lord, would build the temple. That promise is followed in chapter 8 by a list of David's great victories. And at the end of the chapter, by a description of the organization of his administration. David has accomplished a lot. And there's really only one thing left on his to-do list, and that is to deal with the remnants of the house of Saul. Now, because we just recently did a survey of the story of Israel in the Old Testament, you know what would normally happen when one dynasty replaces another dynasty, because we read it take place over and over again. Any remaining family members of the old king would be rounded up and would be disposed of. It's what Baasha did to the house of Jeroboam. It's what Zimri did to the house of Baasha. It's what Athaliah tried to do to the entire house of David. You get the idea. So if we were dealing with your typical ordinary ancient despot here in 2 Samuel chapter 9, we know exactly what would happen. All of the remnants of the house of Saul would be hunted down and they would be exterminated. But we're not dealing with any ordinary king. So read with me the opening verses of 2 Samuel chapter 9. And David said, "Is there still anyone left of the house of Saul, that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? Now there was a servant of the house of Saul whose name was Ziba, and they called him to David. And the king said to him, 'Are you Ziba?' And he said, 'I am your servant.' And the king said, 'Is there not still someone of the house of Saul, that I may show the kindness of God to him?' Ziba said to the king, 'There is still a son of Jonathan. He is crippled in his feet.'" We are introduced to this son of Jonathan way back in chapter 4. So you remember how 1 Samuel ends. David has been pursued by Saul for years. This allows the Philistine menace to grow. And eventually, by the end of the book of 1 Samuel, it has grown to the point that it overpowers King Saul. There is a battle that takes place at the end of 1 Samuel. And in that battle, Jonathan dies, and also his father Saul dies. Well, when the word of that disastrous defeat reaches the palace back in Israel, the Bible says that people began to flee. And a nurse picked up Jonathan's son, who was only 5 years old, and began to try to flee the city. And in the haste and in the panic of the moment, the little boy falls. And as a result of that fall, he is injured. Both of his feet are crippled. The little boy's name is Mephibosheth. And now, a few years later, he is summoned to come before the new king, the leader of the new dynasty, David. And just to remind us of his family's complicated past with David, look at how verse 6 identifies him. and Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, who is one of David's closest friends, the son of Saul, who is David's sworn enemy, came to David and fell on his face and paid homage. I wonder what went through Mephibosheth's mind when the messenger shows up and says, David would like to see you, knowing how his grandfather had hunted David down like a dog for years. Did he know enough about how power politics worked that he knew what would typically happen to ex-royal family members like him? Verse 6 goes on to say, he answered, behold, I am your servant. I think we are on safe ground in assuming that Mephibosheth must have been at least a little bit worried because of what David says to him in verse 7. David said to him, do not fear. Usually when people say don't fear, it's because they think you've got a reason to be afraid and they want to assure you that you shouldn't be afraid. But David goes much further. David doesn't simply say, Mephibosheth, don't be afraid, I'm not going to execute you, which would have been great if you were Mephibosheth to hear that. But he goes much further. Do not fear, verse 7, for I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan, and I will restore to you all the land of Saul your father, and you shall eat at my table always. Not only is Mephibosheth told, I'm going to spare your life, but David goes much further than that. He says, instead of, which would have typically been the case, confiscating the family property and using it for my benefit, David says, I'm going to make sure you have that property. And in fact, not only does David make sure he has the property, remember Mephibosheth is crippled, he can't work it himself. If you look down in verses 9 and 10, David also makes arrangements for there to be workers who can till the land, so that now Mephibosheth, who by virtue of the fact that he's crippled is absolutely helpless, now will have provision for his basic necessities. And not only that, look at what David says at the end of verse 7. You shall eat at my table always. Hospitality is a big deal even in our culture, which is so far removed historically from the culture of David. Some of you may have such close friends that they say to you, you always have a place at our table. I have friends just like that. And when people say that, what are they conveying? What they're saying is, you're part of the family as far as we're concerned. You've always got room at our table. In the ancient world, hospitality was even more significant. And when you ate a meal with someone, when you shared a table with someone, it conveyed a message of close fellowship and acceptance, that you really are family. So by telling Mephibosheth, you can eat at my table, what David is saying to him is not simply, hey, we're not enemies. It's much more than that. We're family. You're welcome here at my table. Now, why did David do all of these things? Why did he spare Mephibosheth? That's great. Why did he give Mephibosheth land and servants to work the land to provide for him? That's amazing. Why did he even say to him, you can eat at my table? Well, we saw the word 3 times in what I've read to you this morning. You saw it in verse 1 and verse 3 and verse 7. It is the word kindness. David says, I want to show the kindness of God to you. This word is a very significant word in the Old Testament, but it's also very hard to translate just by one term. It's a word that means something like covenant, love, and faithfulness. It is a sense of profound loyalty and also kindness. In fact, if you go back and read the story of David and Jonathan, you will find the word covenant used several times in their relationship. In 1 Samuel 18, Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. And now, because of that covenant with Jonathan, even though Mephibosheth could not offer David anything to earn or to deserve his kindness, he nevertheless receives kindness, covenant, kindness, loyalty, and love from David. And the account concludes down in verse 13 by saying this: So Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, for he ate always at the king's table. Now he was lame in both his feet. Now I want you to think about this story of a lame man who is invited to eat at the king's table, as we turn to the Gospel of Luke chapter 14. Luke chapter 14. Luke chapter 14. Now, if you notice in verse 1, the Bible tells us that Jesus is invited to come and eat at the house of a ruler of the Pharisees. And the text also tells us that these people were watching Jesus like a hawk. Now, I want you to notice that in response to this dinner invitation, Jesus tells two stories. The first story has to do with seating arrangements. Where do you sit when you eat at a banquet? And the point that Jesus makes in this story is, don't choose to sit at the place of honor. As he explains in verse 11 of Luke 14, everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. And then Jesus gives this instruction to the man who invited him in verse 12. When you give a dinner or a banquet, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, lest they also invite you in return and you be repaid. But when you give a feast, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you. And then Jesus tells a story to illustrate this point. And the story is of a man who has a great banquet, and he invites the people you would typically expect to be invited to such a banquet, but these people, they reject the invitation. They don't want to come to it. And so when the man hears this, he gives instructions to his servant in the end of verse 21 and says, I want you to go out quickly to the streets and lanes of the city and bring in the poor and the crippled and the blind and the lame. Now then, why does Jesus tell these stories? Is Jesus so concerned about the rules of social etiquette, like Dear Abby, that he wants to give instructions here about the seating position at a banquet and the kind of invitations that you should extend? From a physical point of view, Jesus has already explained who the poor and the crippled and the lame and the blind are. They are helpless people. They are beggars. They cannot possibly earn or deserve a place at your banquet table. Remember, that's the point Jesus made in verse 12 when he says, don't invite the rich neighbors, lest they also invite you in return and you be repaid. It's the point he makes in verse 14. You will be blessed because they cannot repay you. In other words, those who are crippled, like Mephibosheth, eat at the king's table purely as an act of grace, of covenant kindness by the king. Now then, from a spiritual point of view, who are those who could not possibly earn or deserve or even repay a place at the king's table? Those who are spiritually poor and crippled and lame and blind, like those described at the start of the next chapter, which says this: "Now the tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to hear him, and the Pharisees and the scribes grumbled, saying, 'This man receives sinners and eats with them.'" Did tax collectors and sinners have anything at all to offer Jesus to earn or deserve a meal with him? Absolutely not. They were as spiritually needy as the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind were physically. And as Luke chapter 15 is telling us, they were the very people who were drawn to Jesus, the people that Jesus received and ate with. Meanwhile, what about those who at least saw themselves as spiritually rich and strong and healthy and perceptive? The scribes and Pharisees. They reject the invitation of Jesus, just like in that story Jesus told in chapter 14. They are not only refusing the invitation, they are resentful of those who do accept it. In the banquet stories that Jesus tells in Luke chapter 14, he teaches that the lame ought to be welcome at your table. And in his ministry among the tax collectors and sinners in Luke chapter 15, he practiced what he preached by eating with the spiritually poor and lame and crippled and blind. He was showing kindness, covenant, love, and loyalty and faithfulness to those who were spiritually helpless, just like David showed to Mephibosheth. And today, we now gather at the king's table, we who are spiritually lame. We have nothing to offer the king to deserve or merit this invitation. Indeed, like Mephibosheth, but on a spiritual plane, ordinarily we should expect it to be condemned. But instead, Jesus has offered us a covenant, faithfulness, kindness. He has offered us a place at his table. He has offered to treat us as part of the family. We are here because Jesus still receives sinners and eats with them. Now, we're not the people we once were. We are sinners, but we are forgiven sinners, and we are growing in grace. And we are lame, but thanks to Jesus, we are in a process of recovery, and we are growing in strength. And as we partake of the Lord's Supper this morning, we look forward to the day when we will gather at the marriage supper of the Lamb and come around the king's table when our transformation is complete and we are bright and pure. But in the meantime, we rejoice today that the lame are still welcome at the king's table.